Hi, I'm David Liss, a DC-based consultant and journalist, your host for this series of podcasts, Wellness Musketeers, where we will discuss a wide range of topics in the field of health, wellness, and physical fitness, with a bit of management and economics thrown in as well. Our three experts, or co-conspirators, as they like to call themselves, are Dr. Richard Kennedy, Mike James, aka Aussie Mike, and Kettle Viting. Each bring over 30 years of international experience in the health, fitness, and wellness field. In this episode, we are joined by our guest panelist, Nadine Chapman. She is manager of mediation services at the World Bank Group. In this podcast, we will take some of the stress away from considerations related to conflict. Unresolved conflict can erode the strength and satisfaction of relationships and even make people feel physically sick or in pain. Our expert, Nadine Chapman, will help you understand how and why conflict is a natural and unavoidable part of life, and show you how constructive conflict can be a powerful catalyst for change. Mike, would you like to get the ball rolling?
When people hear the word conflict, it brings up rather unpleasant visions of confrontations they may have had in the past with friend or foe. But at least I can point to conflict that have good things, because that's how I met Nadine at the World Bank. In about 2002, I think, somehow one of our esteemed 4,000 fitness centre members decided to bypass the fitness centre management, i.e. me, and go directly to mediation services in Nadine concerning an issue regarding somebody putting in their own piece of exercise equipment and not allowing others to use it, not allowing other kids to play with their toys, in other words. Now, this is hardly a world-breaking issue, but that's often the nature of conflict, where seemingly minor issues can escalate to become major incidents. Thankfully, this issue was resolved very quickly, and I got to know Nadine very well, and she became one of my unofficial board of advisors, along with Dr. Kennedy, of course, during my career at the World Bank. So, Nadine, I'm sure examples like this one are a tip of a very, very large iceberg. Can you give us some more insight into your role and what you've learned from your career in mediation services?
Mike, it is a pleasure to be here, and conflict resolution and mediation is really my lifeblood. I love working with individuals who are in conflict, and I have to tell you that conflict is extremely dynamic. A lot of people, when they think of conflict or they hear conflict, they get nervous or they instantly have a negative reaction. I have dedicated my career to empowering people and helping them transform their lives by dealing with conflict head on and at the lowest level.
What's some of the reasons people will avoid conflict, do you think, Nadine?
I think there are a number of reasons why people avoid conflict. I'll start with culture. I believe that there are some cultures where the messaging around conflict is that it is not good. And I've even had people tell me that in their country of origin, getting in conflict can literally end your life prematurely. So some individuals are raised in cultures that are conflict avoidant, or where dealing with conflict is not something that's encouraged or rewarded. And then there are other cultures, I will use the American culture as an example, where conflict is not necessarily seen as something to avoid. And it's viewed as something that is inevitable and natural, or more natural. That said, there are people in every culture that will find it difficult to deal with conflict. So I believe conflict is dynamic. I avoid stereotypes because I have met people of all cultures, some who like conflict and some who abhor it. What I have seen is that individuals who are able to address conflict at its lowest level are usually the people that are most effective in addressing it.
What do you mean by lowest level?
Thank you for asking me that question, Dave. The lowest level, I would say, begins with you. I always like using the Michael Jackson Man in the Mirror. I believe that whenever you find yourself in conflict, the first thing that you should do is look at yourself and say, what have I done? How am I feeling? How am I contributing to this ill sense that I have as it relates to other people, or even how I feel internally when something happens. So to me, the ground zero is you, yourself. And then once you've looked at yourself and you've said, maybe this really isn't about me, maybe it is about the dynamic that I'm having with this individual, then I recommend that you go to the person that you're having the issue with and you try to find an appropriate time and place to have a conversation with them about the issue. If you are unable to resolve it, then it can go further to an office like mine, which is mediation, where we have a third party neutral who will sit with you and the other party and help facilitate a conversation that will hopefully uncover what is really going on.
Nadine, thank you again for joining us. What are some of the different ways people deal with conflict?
That's a fabulous question. People deal with conflict in a variety of ways. I like to use a continuum. On one side of the continuum is flight, and on the other side of the continuum is fight. And then we have everything that lies in between. So what I have seen is that there are some people who avoid conflict at any cost. And we call those the individuals who prefer flight. Like a bird, they'd rather fly away than actually address the conflict or the issue. Then there are people who like to deal with conflict timely and with the individuals that they have the issue with. Then you have people who like to fight in court or to have a third party come in, either as a mediator or an investigator or a judge in that realm. And then on the other extreme, you have people who will literally fight. And the sad thing is every day when I watch the news or I read articles, you will see examples of people who unfortunately resort to violence in dealing with conflict. And that is the most ineffective way to deal with conflict. It's extremely detrimental.
Early on in my management career, I think I was like an overprotective parent, if you will, and tried to avoid conflict in my staff meetings and so forth, until one of my participants told me that I needed to let go of the reins. People used to use boxing parlance, swap a few punches, or just let it get out, and let people have their own little fight, if you will, if that's the right word. And I found that a very beneficial point when she told me. And that was a long time ago. Only courses now, say, a manager like myself or anyone else, about conflict resolution. Where can people look to get that sort of knowledge, or is it you learn the hard way? I hope that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. I am very happy to say that a lot of organizations, including the World Bank, currently offer a variety of training sessions and courses on conflict resolution and conflict management. Also, a lot of organizations offer courses in communication skills, negotiation skills, and even mediation skills. So what I have seen is very much an opening in this area. When I started my career over 20 years ago, there weren't many offerings in the organization that I worked in around this topic. But now what I'm seeing, particularly at the World Bank, is that there are numerous courses that are available to managers, to supervisors, and also to staff to help them learn how to communicate more effectively and also how to address conflict, not only internally, but with others that they work with.
Are there any differences between how men and women deal with conflict?
That's a very interesting question. I have found that in my practice in mediation, what I have observed is that we tend to have more women who use mediation than men. There is not a huge gap, but there is a difference. We do find that women tend to use more conciliatory methods to resolve conflict, whereas we find that the more formal mechanisms to resolve conflict, which may be more adversarial in nature, tend to be dominated more by men. I don't know if that has something to do with the way that men and women are socialized, but we do see that women tend to address conflict more informally than met in general.
What are the foundations for constructive conflict?
I think one of the foundations for constructive conflict is you need to have two people who are fairly reasonable in order to actually have the conflict resolve itself in an amicable or mutually satisfactory manner. And what do I mean by that? What I find is that when individuals are in conflict with someone, there's a tendency to vilify that person and to lose sight of their humanity. So one foundation to resolving conflict is to really be able to listen, to have an open mind, and to be willing to see the person not as an enemy, but as someone that you have a misunderstanding with, and to work from there. That sounds very easy, but trust me, it is often very difficult when you are in conflict to try to see the humanity in the person that you are having the conflict with. What I have found very useful is to shift people away from their position and have them look at what their needs are. Not only what their needs are, but also to try to hear what the other party's needs are. So, for example, what I find in conflict is that I often have two people who are actually mirroring each other. So one person will say, you know what, you don't respect me. And the other person will say, you don't respect me either. Or what's even more interesting is when you have two people who are saying that what drives them crazy about the other person is the same thing that's driving the other person crazy about them. And I like to call that mirroring. We often see a lot of that in conflict.
How does conflict benefit people in general? Does it benefit individuals more so than organizations?
I believe that conflict benefits everyone. If I reflect back on my life, I will tell you that my relationships that have been the strongest are those that have had to go through some level of conflict. What I find is that when you're in conflict with an individual, you often learn about them. You learn about their values. You learn about their boundaries. You learn about their unmet needs. And that information is extremely catalytic. It can be catalytic and cathartic. So I believe that when individuals have conflict and they're able to constructively deal with it, it actually can make the relationship stronger over time than weaker. And I also find that organizations that are conflict avoidant tend to often lag in innovation. Also, sometimes they have high levels of turnover or absenteeism, because when conflict is not resolved, it impacts you physically and it can also impact you mentally. So unresolved conflict and at the individual level and the organizational level can actually erode the foundation of the structure of the relationship as well as the organization.
We talk about impacts it can have physically. I guess stress would be one of those. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, and perhaps Dr. Kennedy could have a few words on that as well.
Thank you, Mike. What I have seen is the manifestation of conflict. How does it manifest itself? I've seen it manifest itself in stress with people who eventually have mental issues, anxiety, stress, insomnia, people who have skin conditions like eczema. Often when they're under extreme stress, their eczema may be triggered. I'm not the doctor here, so Dr. Kennedy, please jump in. But what I have seen is that unresolved conflict can result in not only physical issues, but also overeating or not eating, and also people terminating relationships and even terminating their employment prematurely in the midst of the conflict.
I want to echo what Nadine said. It's very true that in today's world, it's a very stressful world. And in the workplace, it's stressful everywhere. And one of the things many people don't know how to deal with conflict. And this goes back to what you said at the very beginning, that there's a lot of avoidance initially with conflict because it makes people uncomfortable. Partly because I firmly believe that in dealing with conflict, you also have to deal with yourself, because whatever you're feeling towards the other individual or colleagues or family members, you also take that thought process on. It's why people have insomnia, because they can't turn their minds off. It's why people all of a sudden who've never had any problems with diarrhea start having loose bowel movements or skin reactions, or people who have headaches that they've never had before. And if you press them, they will tell you that, gee, the last time this happened was 15 years ago when I was going through this relationship I was getting out. And I didn't know how to get out of it. And all these same things happen. Or even the same thing, using something as simple as the inanimate conflict, where you're studying for an exam, for finals, and you need to pass this in order to graduate. And so you're studying, you're putting in long hours, etc. And you finally take the test, you're glad it's over, but then all of a sudden you have upset stomach. The same foods you've been eating all your life, now you're throwing them up, or you're having heartburn and gas. This is all the typical manifestations of stress. And conflict is something that there are people who don't want to deal with it, or who would prefer to avoid it. As you said earlier, some people love conflict. Matter of fact, they look for the conflict. And they get something out of it.
So, Dr. Gay, is the actual conflict itself, if it's addressed, is it like a release valve, or is there also getting it off your chest? So
it's like therapeutic.
Yeah.
Because for much of the time, you've been avoiding it, or you've been putting it to the side, but sort of, we talk about people who are procrastinating. Sometimes people procrastinate because it's something they know they need to do. They know they need to address. The circumstances haven't changed. And as they say, it's very difficult to do the same thing again and again and expect a different result.
So given that, Nadine, is it ever too late for conflict resolution? So when they come to your department, is there a cutoff point at some point where, hey, it's gone too far, you're not going to be able to do anything?
That's a really good question. I guess you're asking, is there a statute of limitations when it comes to conflict? But I would like to say that it's never too late. However, my advice is, if you're seeking to have a mutual or amicable resolution, I recommend you come earlier than later. What I have found is that the longer people allow a conflict to fester, it becomes hardened. It's almost like an artery that's blocked. It gets harder because the feelings and the resentment and the anger tend to build over time.
Is there a difference between how conflict should be addressed or considered when it's a personal conflict in a relationship or a family member versus a professional consideration in the workplace?
I think when it comes to conflict, every conflict is unique. I don't know of any two conflicts that are the same. And what I have found, which is interesting, is that sometimes you spend more time in the work environment than you do with your own family. So the conflict may impact you just as deeply with a colleague at work than it would with a family member. So I believe that the approach to use to resolve the conflict really would depend on your bandwidth and what is available to you. As I was saying earlier, I do think that it's very important to start with yourself and then try to talk to the person directly. And that would be the case whether it's a spouse or whether it's a colleague at work. And I also would recommend, if that doesn't work, to try mediation. And there are a lot of mediation programs, not only in the work environment, but there are community mediation programs that are available to help neighbors or to help friends resolve issues. So I guess the long and short to your answer to your question, is I really believe that the mechanisms to resolve conflict really do not vary that much, depending on who's involved in the conflict, in that the tools and the mechanisms that are available can be used either in a personal conflict or in a conflict with a colleague, or even with someone that you don't know that well. You can still use a lot of the different approaches to resolve it.
I had a friend, and he would engage something I'm going to call positive procrastination. So he said he knows himself, and he knows that he loves his wife, and he knows that he loves his wife more than he likes to lose his temper, and that if he's angry, that they need to wait for a time where he can calm down and address things in a way that he won't say something hurtful or that he'll regret. Is that a positive thing, or is that procrastination?
I am not a black or white kind of person. And when I say that with conflict, what I mean is that sometimes avoidance is good. Sometimes procrastination is good, depending on the facts, depending on what is going on. For example, I think most of you may know that we have some very aggressive drivers on the road right now. Avoidance is probably a good tactic when someone is driving aggressively. You may not want to engage them or yell at them or even try to chase them on the road. You may actually want to pull over. So I use that example to say that you have to use your intellect when it comes to addressing conflict. What is the benefit of dealing with the conflict? Does the detriment outweigh the benefit? And then decide what to do at that point.
So it's like learning how to not be impulsive.
Yes, it's trying to breathe. They say when you find yourself triggered, instead of launching off, to try to breathe. Another tactic that I use in the work environment is when I'm annoyed by an email that someone has sent me, instead of hammering out a response right away, to draft it and sit on it, or have someone that I trust read it to see whether the tone is appropriate, instead of shooting off at the hip, which sometimes people do very quickly. And once you do that, you can't take it back, particularly when it comes to email. That can be quite dangerous.
I read that Abe Lincoln, what he used to do was when he would get really angry at someone, he would write a letter but never send it. In many of the workplaces that I've been in the course of my life, there really wasn't the opportunity for third parties or for education. It was more that I had to figure it out on my own or suffer with the consequences of a poorly managed conflict. So for someone who doesn't have access to those kinds of resources or training or third parties, what are 3, 4, 5 things that people should keep in mind to try and look to address a conflict or to move beyond a conflict?
Well, I think it always goes back to you, to the individual. And what I believe is that the more you work on yourself, the better your relationships will be, and the less likely you will be to find yourself in unnecessary conflict. So I really believe that it's very important to know yourself, to know what your triggers are, and to know why those triggers exist, so that when things happen to you, instead of going after the person who's triggering you, you're able to slow down and take control of yourself in the situation. A lot of people have a lot of baggage. The difference between people who I find are more effective in conflict than those who are less effective is that those people who carry the baggage and know what's in it tend to be a lot wiser than those who just throw their luggage around wherever they go without being aware of what the content is.
In your career, and when you've gotten to the point where you had to do mediation for a particular conflict issue, and it seems to be going nowhere, or that you got both sides are at an impasse, what are the steps that you would recommend going forward?
That's a very good question. There's one technique that I use in mediation that often works, or two techniques when people are in conflict or when it appears that they're at an impasse. One technique that we use is called a caucus, where we actually separate the parties and talk to them individually and give them an opportunity to fully express what is going on and why they're feeling the way they are feeling. Another technique that we use is saying, you know what, let's call the session to a close, and why don't we come back? Let's circle back in a day or two. And that often gives people an opportunity to cool down or to really reflect on what's really going on. And then the other technique that we use is we tend to use their language. So we do a lot of paraphrasing and summarizing. And I have found it to be very cathartic when you have a third party neutral who's actually relaying in real time what they hear you saying. Sometimes hearing what you are saying out of the mouth of a third party can actually open you up to see that maybe you're not being reasonable, or maybe they aren't the enemy. So those are some of the techniques that we use. The other technique that I use when I'm dealing with individuals in conflict, or even when I'm in conflict, is silence. Sometimes people feel that they have to keep running their mouths and talking, and that often does not help. So sometimes just being quiet, not in a passive aggressive way, but just in a reflective way, can sometimes help diffuse conflict and help people move forward.
You did mention passive aggressive and how people address things in a passive aggressive way. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I believe that we all have different styles. Some people tend to be more passive aggressive in that instead of dealing with issues directly, they tend to either use indirect language, or they tend to remove themselves, or sometimes they do extreme silent treatment instead of directly addressing conflict. And I find that style may work for people sometimes, but if you use it all the time, it will not be effective. Just like being directive. Some people are very direct in dealing with conflict. That may work sometimes, but it may not work all the time. So I always say, be mindful of your style, and be mindful that style is not always going to work for you, and be agile and be willing to change your style when necessary to help move things forward or help to strengthen a relationship.
Okay, Nadine, I know this is a passion of yours, you know it very well, but I imagine that it wouldn't be easy in a lot of ways. That must be sort of stress-inducing for yourself. How did you combat stress personally?
It can be a stressful job. I think what helps me a lot is I try not to get emotionally attached to people's conflict. So the beauty of mediation is that I tell people, it's your problem, it's my process. So I am there to facilitate their resolution of their problem. I have found mediators who are not able to do that, who feel that if the parties don't come to a resolution, that it's their fault or it's a failure on their part. Once you become emotionally attached to someone else's conflict, to me, you are no longer effective. And I believe I've been blessed with the ability to detach myself and at the same time show empathy. And that is not always easy to do.
Would you say 80% of the conflicts are these 3 or 4 kinds of issues? What are the most common kinds of conflicts?
I think the most common kind of conflict is just a very simple misunderstanding, not understanding what people's needs are, and also not taking the time to get to know people and know what their needs are. So, for example, if someone has a need for autonomy, if they feel that they're being micromanaged, or if they feel that someone has control issues, that's going to end up being a conflict because someone who needs autonomy does not want someone who is hovering over them. But often we don't know that until it becomes a friction point. So what I have found is that in relationships where people do not take the time to get to know each other and to understand what motivates the person that they're engaged with, that usually will result in a conflict eventually. How large a conflict it is will depend on their emotional intelligence and also their own self-awareness in general. But I cannot say that there's only one type of conflict. Now, if you ask me where I work at the World Bank, what types of conflict we deal with, I can tell you those types of conflict, but I could not tell you the universe of conflict. In the work environment, we see conflicts around interpersonal conflict. We see conflicts around ending employment issues, performance management issues. We see harassment and bullying. So those are some of the conflict issues that we see. But interpersonal conflict universally, I think, is the most prevalent type of conflict.
Dean, you've given us quite a bit of information today, and I've learned a lot. And I wonder, are there 3 or 4 key points that you would like to summarize for us that we should take away from this discussion today?
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here. There are 3 things that I can think of. One is that conflict is unavoidable and natural. I believe that some people wish there was a magic wand and we could wish conflict away. Conflict is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. So conflict is natural and unavoidable is one point. Another point is that conflict can be transformative and cathartic if it is addressed appropriately. I have seen people literally turn their lives around or make profound life-saving decisions as a result of being in conflict. And then the third point that I want to share is that conflict resolution begins with you. The more healthy you are, the more self-aware you are, and the more loving you are to yourself, the less likely you will be to find yourself in conflict. I find people who are depleted emotionally or people who have been traumatized and not dealt with that trauma often transfer that onto other people who do not deserve it. So those are 3 points that I'd like to share as it relates to conflict.
We appreciate you joining us here, Nadine. And thank you, listener, for joining us for Wellness Musketeers. Tune in for upcoming episodes to learn from global health leaders and authors to gain tools to improve your health, work performance, and live a more balanced quality of life. Please subscribe, give us a 5-star review, share this recording with your family, friends, and colleagues. You can make a contribution through a link provided in our program notes to allow this podcast to grow. Please let us know what you need to learn to help you live your best life. Send your questions and ideas for future episodes to Dave Liss at davidmliss@gmail.com. Thank you.